Welcome to Elixir Wizards, a podcast brought to you by SmartLogic, a custom web and mobile development shop based in Baltimore. My name is Justus Eapen, and I will be your host today. We are bringing you Season 4 of Elixir Wizards, and we've decided this season's theme, taking into consideration much feedback from our audience, who are brilliant and smart and very helpful. We've decided that this season's theme is going to be system and application architecture. So normally we would produce a short 2 to 3 minute trailer to give you a preview into the season theme and how we're thinking about it. But we thought that since this is season 4 and we just finished the first trilogy, we would stick to the old trope of starting a second trilogy by totally upending everything that made the original great. And so we're going to forgo doing a trailer, and instead we're going to launch the season with a full-on interview exploring this season's theme of system and application architecture with my esteemed co-host, Eric Oestrich, and the director of development at SmartLogic, Dan Ivovich. How are you guys doing?
Doing well.
Eric, how are you?
Doing great. That
was all just a really long intro for you two.
Well, you know, like our wisdom, it is epic.
So we got a lot of feedback between the seasons and while doing season 3 from the folks that listen to the show. And we want to take it really seriously. And we want to continue providing like absolutely the highest quality Elixir podcast that we can possibly produce. So one of the pieces of feedback that we got a lot, and so we're going to be implementing some of this feedback into season 4, is that we should talk a little bit more personally with the guests that make it onto the show. So Eric and I are on every episode of the show. Dan, you've been on several episodes. Dan, could you just kick off can you give us a little bit of background on yourself, like how you got to be the director of development operations at SmartLogic, how you came to letting Eric and I do this show?
Sure. You know, SmartLogic, I joined coming up on 9 years ago as a Rails developer, back when that was kind of SmartLogic's big focus. You know, over a couple of years working as a developer there, I established, some amount of expertise and leadership around project management and making sure that things are being architected well and that we're heading down the happy path of client satisfaction. And through conversations with the owner, we kind of, like any good startup, invented a position that became the director of development operations. And like any good job description, over the probably now 7 and change years that I've been doing this job, it has evolved from, making sure projects are running smoothly to now, managing the entire team and making sure that we have the right people in the right roles on the right contracts to, maintain that level of excellence that we expect from SmartLogic.
And we recently made another new role for somebody at SmartLogic, isn't that right?
We did. We made a new role for Eric because Eric's been with this company just about as long as I have.
Just about.
Well, Eric was an intern before I was a full-time hire. It's a hotly contested topic as far as who's been with the company longer. But yes, we just created a technical architect role for Eric, and trying to, as my role has kind of progressed more into that, full-on team, people, career, leadership, making sure that we're executing on contracts. I wanted to make sure that we had a focus on good design of systems, good professional development tracks for the employees, good, decision-making into should we adopt new frameworks? Should we use certain libraries? Should we open source things that we're working on? I mean, obviously we should, but I guess the question would be more, can we? And so those things have fed into Eric's new job description as a technical architect.
Eric, you joined SmartLogic as an intern. Did you think that you were going to be here 9 years later and promoted to the only technical architect at SmartLogic?
I'm not really sure how long I thought it'd be here or whatever. I do remember, so I joined while I was in senior year of college as an intern, and then 2 days after I graduated, I think I had a weekend from graduation to starting full time. And so that was how I started. The one thing I do remember was we were at a RailsConf and I found the Valve hiring thing or whatever. So that was 9 years ago. Eric wanted to be working at Valve doing something. So I don't know. That obviously didn't pan out.
Employee manual. Is that what you're talking about? That is such a great document. Everyone should read that document. It's really good. Valve is a great company. So Eric, is it true that this was your only full-time job ever?
I guess it was during the summer, it was a full-time like computer support position at the college. So but that was, I don't know if that counts as like, this is what I would consider my, I guess, I don't know.
Well, you're kind of a unicorn in that regard. You like, your whole career has been like at SmartLogic and just building stuff here. And you've just been able to be heads down for so long. And like, you got OSS, open source software, like out the wazoo, that I think we're going to talk about in this interview. But it's kind of the opposite of Dan, because you came from like corporate, like building like super duper. I mean, I don't even like weapons of war. Or like,
no, I mean, I was at a defense contractor, but I was not doing that sort of work. But yeah, out of college, I got a job with a defense contractor in Maryland. So yeah, I came from 100,000 plus employee company to SmartLogic, which was probably maybe 10 at the time. So definite difference for sure.
Yeah,
10, and then I think quickly shrunk to 6 at that point, because there's like waves of people that leave.
Yeah, I came in. I came in right at the kind of the tail end of one of those kind of cohorts, moving on to other things. So yeah, but we're now at the point where Eric is the only direct report I have that I didn't hire. So,
wow. And we're at what, 12 right now? Is that right?
Well, 9 on the product team. So product designer and developer, and 2.5 of support plus me.
Just hired a new engineer. He's having a great first day. Recording this on his first day. I don't know if we probably don't want to get into that, but
we've had a season on, getting jobs and hiring and training and all of that. So let's move on.
There's lots of people looking for jobs right now, and I keep seeing them on Twitter. So it is worth pointing out that SmartLogic is always hiring.
Well, for those listening in the future, we're recording this during the height of the 2020 pandemic. So that is why we're seeing a lot of people looking for new work.
Yeah, I was actually struggling before I almost asked you guys like how timely you want to keep this episode, and I think we'll just see how it goes, because we can always edit it. So yeah, that was some of the interesting parts, like from knowing you guys pretty well and sort of your paths. Like Eric, you've got a very kind of unconventional in tech kind of career path to be like at one place and be able to see like these technologies develop over time. It's really fascinating. And I feel like I came at the best time, like in the last 3 years, where like when I met you, like I immediately knew you were one of the most productive people I'd ever met. And I was like, oh my goodness, how did he get this way? And there's something about like not only do we have a huge diversity of like different types of people that end up at SmartLogic, but where people go when they leave SmartLogic is really diverse too. Like, I don't know, like I think when I got here, people were leaving for Amazon and for Under Armour and for Facebook. Someone had just left. So yeah, SmartLogic, I think, produces some pretty incredible talented engineers, and that's a really cool thing about working here. We have a question here about favorite underrated Elixir resources, and we want to know, Dan, I want to know what resource or like what happened that convinced you that SmartLogic should go all in on Elixir. I know it's not exactly a resource, but maybe it involves a resource or multiple resources.
Sure. I mean, so you could argue that the resource for that was a former employee who, was very passionate about functional programming and specifically Elixir. And we had a small project. It was like, this would probably take a person a couple weeks in Rails type of project. And, he was convinced he could do it just as fast and just as well in Elixir. And it was kind of like, you know what, like, this is a pretty low risk as far as the company's concerned. If it doesn't go well, we'll probably know halfway through the 2 weeks. And then, so all we've lost is a week, so that seemed kind of like a no brainer. I think we did the project and it went well, and then we deployed it, and then we didn't have to touch it, and then still didn't have to touch it, and then still didn't have to touch it. And, it was just like, okay, like, so we definitely got something that checks kind of that stable box, and Eric and I being here, as long as we have seen several iterations of, the right way to deploy a Rails app or the right way to do this, that, or the other thing with Rails, and have seen all sorts of timeouts and memory issues and things like that can happen. And Elixir has gone through some similar growth around how to properly deploy. But, I think we just saw, at least at its core, maybe the how has changed a bit, but the what you get when you deploy an Elixir app has been solid since day one. So I think, that's kind of like the first box to check. We can't put something into production and have to be supporting it like crazy. So then from there, then it was really about exploring the ecosystem, exploring the language, exploring the resources, looking at Phoenix and Ecto as our, parallels to Rails and Active Record, and say, okay, like, can we build what we need to build, and can we build it better, faster, in a state that's more maintainable? And for me, the aha moment was, deep diving on Ecto and seeing change sets and thinking about all of the callbacks and validations and, attributes and things that I've added to Rails models over the years to make it work the way I want it to work, and how painful that can be to support, even a few months later, and seeing the patterns in Ecto as just a path where, so much of what we do is data driven, and everything about functional programming is based on the data flowing. And that cemented it for me, 100%, that interacting with the database and building a solid app with Ecto was what I wanted to do.
And so this was what, like 2016, 2017, early 2017, maybe?
Yeah, something in that ballpark.
Tail end of 2015, because I think I had just moved.
2015.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whoa.
I mean, for that first app probably was about then. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I got there in 2017 and it was like just in full swing, I feel like.
Yeah. It wasn't until about 2017 that it was, 9 out of 10 new apps were Elixir. So it was, this was a year and a half before that point, where we were just kind of trying it out. And I think we did one other project in that time frame. And then, then after that, it just became, okay, unless there's a compelling reason to not, mostly like client requests because of their own, internal skill set, to just keep pushing Elixir.
And do you remember like any specific resources that helped you pick it up when you were first learning?
Like the programming Elixir, programming Phoenix books, I worked through, probably 75% of one and 50% of the other.
Right.
I tend to be just kind of immerse yourself in something. I really tried to like read the book cover to cover and do all the exercises. And, I was like, oh, okay, I want to learn this the right way with all the fundamentals, because my exposure to Ruby and Rails was very, like a lot of Rails developers, was like, you learn Rails and you don't really know where the lines are between Rails and Ruby itself. And I really wanted to try to avoid that. Turns out that's way less of a problem because Phoenix is super lightweight and mostly just like glues things together. But yeah, so that was kind of my approach. And then, then it's just been kind of the typical way that I think a lot of people learn stuff, try it out, rebuild something that you've built yourself. I have little kind of like side projects I've done in Rails and in Go. And, so it's like, try those in Elixir. Okay, great. And then my position at SmartLogic has made it where a lot of my Elixir learning is, reading other people's Elixir code as well, so pull requests and pull request reviews and then getting in there and kind of helping, learn by doing.
Eric, what about you? Do you have, and I want to follow up on this question with both of you, but do you have a favorite like Elixir resource that helped you when you were first picking up? And also maybe just talk a little bit about that time, if you remember it, and how the adoption cycle went at SmartLogic, since it was before I was here.
So we had that small project, and then like 4 months later, I want to say, we had another one that kicked up that we started doing, and like that was my first big project at that point. And yeah, we were planning on doing all these cool things and whatnot, and then like I think we were going to try out Absinthe and all that fun stuff. And then I was like, all right, this is all too much new stuff. So then we went back to the thing I knew of, just like standard REST stuff, because it was like just too much at once. So we did that. And then I think that project went for, I don't know, 6 months maybe, and did as some startups do, as it fizzled out. And then we had a little while later, I think was our next big one, towards the beginning of 2017 maybe, was our next big one.
I joined in March of 2017, and there was at least a couple of like projects at that point. Because I was working on Elixir, not on day one, but pretty early.
Yeah. So anyways, whenever there was like kind of two big projects that I was involved in that kind of kicked off my Elixir stuff. And then during the summer, I think of 2017, I like had some PD time. So I just like pulled down Ranch, and Ranch is the TCP acceptor library. So I set that up and kind of played around with letting it be like a chat socket type of thing for Telnet. As everyone may or may not know at this point, if you're listening to this, I write mud software. So that's how that started, was just like an echo server that just like spit back what you said, and then it turned into a chat server, and then kind of just kept morphing until it became Xventure. And so a lot of my learning came from doing a side project and like going just being like, okay, I finished my last thing that I wanted to do. I want to do this new thing. Scroll through what's something I've heard of that I've never used before. Like one weekend, I just was like, I've never done ets, so let's try ets. And whatever the next thing I was working on, I just like used ets and made it work.
I think we all, and this is probably an engineer, like creative type thing where people have to learn by doing, right? Like you have to come up with some sort of project or portfolio piece to work on. I wanted to follow up with this resource question because we're talking about Elixir resources. Have you read any good books on architecture? Because Eric, you read the book about like architecting apps with OTP, right?
Yeah, the one that I read was Designing for Scalability with Erlang OTP.
Right.
That was a pretty good book that kind of helped like the initial foundation of my like programming stuff. I haven't really read too many other Elixir books recently. I know there's
architecture books like more broadly. Yeah.
There's a few, if you're interested in like web APIs of the RESTful nature, there's a few good books that one of the co-organizers of RESTfest, which I'm actually wearing the shirt right now, no one else can see, but my co-host can. So I'm a core organizer for that I just kind of, I don't know, got accepted into. But one of the main organizers who started it all, Mike Amundsen, has a lot of books at O'Reilly all about HTTP stuff. And pretty much anyone that he's written should be good. But there's a pretty good one about designing APIs that he did that I cannot remember the name, but I will make sure we have a link for.
Dan, what about you? Do you have any favorite books or resources just on architecture more generally?
I do not.
I just started reading Bruce Tate's book on, it's called Designing Elixir Systems with OTP, I think. And that's
I have a healthy stack of, I wish I had time to read books in this vein. Yeah,
You're pretty busy, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I think from an architecture standpoint, I just have a lot of lessons learned from 9 years of working on basically every project SmartLogic has ever worked on. I've been involved in some way.
Yeah. Well, so let's dive into the meaty questions here about architecture, design. Like, Dan, do you have a preferred style of design? Domain-driven design, test-driven design, behavior? What is PDD? I don't even know that. Paper-driven design. That's what I do.
PowerPoint-driven design.
PowerPoint. PowerPoint-driven design. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we like to use TDD. We've definitely experimented with BDD, more style approaches, like your cucumber style approach, describe a behavior, write a test that implements that behavior, make that test pass. I think there's a lot of misdirection that gets kind of added in there, and I've seen that lead projects kind of astray. So I generally shy away from that.
I believe I believe you have a lot of opinions on specifically Cucumber, Justus.
I think all three of us have a lot of opinions on Cucumber.
Yeah, I mean, I think that let's besmirch Cucumber's good name. I think it's time. Someone needs to do it. Someone just needs to say it. Why would you ever do this to yourself? It's so bad. I need someone to come out of the woodwork and defend Cucumber. If you're listening to this and you think Cucumber is worthwhile over like just RSpec and Capybara, I want to hear it.
We'll let you record a special episode with Justus defending Cucumber.
But you should go into it, Dan, like because you, I think, started moving away from Cucumber before I started complaining about it.
Well, I think Cucumber's strength is also its big fault, right? It's infinitely configurable because you take plain English language and you turn it into implementation. And you can do that in ways that are effective, and you can do that in ways that are really horrible. And so you can really make a mess for yourself. And I have seen us write some Cucumber that's reasonable, and I've seen us write stuff that's horrible. And I think it leads you into a false sense of, I can get a lot of reuse, right? Every time I want a user to do something, I'll just reuse this statement.
Yeah.
And then you find the case where that statement doesn't quite apply, or the English isn't quite what you want it to be. And then so you parameterize it, and now you've complicated everything, and you have to go back and change it everywhere. And so I think the people who seem to like Cucumber, I think, and I don't know because I've been kind of disconnected from this community for a while, they take the approach of don't reuse anything. Every Cucumber file you write is a clean slate, and its implementation is unique to that file. And so I think if you're going to do that, then it's like, why not just write the tests? And I think if you have a stakeholder or a product owner or somebody who can collaborate with you on the Cucumber files, and you can say, okay, this is our spec. And if we write tests that implement the true meaning, the essence of what this English statement says, then we will build the right behavior. That is probably possible. but I think it is very
These
difficult.
People must exist somewhere.
Well, I think it takes a lot of discipline, and it takes a very involved product owner.
Yeah.
And, when you're a consultancy and you're collaborating with, we talk to our product owners, every day, but that's still probably not enough bandwidth to really use Cucumber to that extent, to use it right in that way. And then I think the other thing that happens with Cucumber is that you're testing from as outside of the system as possible, which is fantastic, but it's slow. And you can write way too much Cucumber that's testing things that are not truly relevant to the behavior of your system. Yes, they are the behaviors your system has, but are they really are they core behaviors? Is that really what you want to be testing? And so you get this bloat of this giant test suite that no one wants to run. And that when you do want to fix something or make a change, you now have to make a change in so many places. And so I think that's where the long-term maintenance of a giant Cucumber suite is I think outweighs really any of its benefits if you're doing good, from my opinion. If you can replace it with a good mix of healthy integration tests, a good mix of true good unit tests, make sure your components work correctly, then make sure they integrate correctly. And then, yes, do a full end-to-end test on the most critical business cases for your application so that you can ensure from a regression standpoint that you don't break checkout or sign up or your ability to make money. Do those things.
But do them in Capybara.
But don't try to make sure that your error messages text is correct and is formatted correctly or is translating correctly at the Cucumber level.
Yeah. We should do season 4 video, and I'll tell you why. Because you could clip out just Dan's little rant right there, and you could repost it as a 3-minute video that's Dan Ivovich destroys behavior-driven design, and I would totally click that every single time. But I
also see both Justus and I at the same time, mostly just shaking, nodding and agreeing with everything.
So yeah, definitely we should do video. If our marketing department listens to that, then you know my opinion, Rose. What style of design do you prefer? So I want to talk a little bit more about design because I want Eric to define for me domain-driven design. I don't know what it is. Tell me what it is.
I'm not sure I fully understand either. I think we had someone at Lone Star. There was someone who did a presentation that kind of included it. I think he said he was part of the domain-driven design ecosystem. I think it's sort of similar to BDD, but different nouns or something. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah. I just know it's a thing, so we included it in our script.
Well, I have to say,
I think we're 3 people who all seem to prefer test-driven design. With maybe a little PowerPoint-driven just at the onset to make sure you understand stuff. I think flow diagrams are important, right, to understanding what it is you're going to build. So, for what it's worth, I think that's the approach the 3 of us take.
So I thought that domain-driven design was I thought Phoenix is a framework that encourages domain-driven design because you're creating contexts, right? And contexts are your application business logic is organized in such a way that it makes sense in context of the domain, right? The business logic domain. So that's what I thought DDD was. And this is so funny because someone's going to come out of the woodwork and be like, this is what domain-driven design is, you idiots. But
I think you're right.
So they're not mutually exclusive.
Core domain, complex designs on a model, right? And I think we get there, right? And if you go through the design process we usually go through as far as, talking about the data, talking about the nouns, talking about the flows,
right?
Describing the behaviors, these things fall out of it, right? And I think part of the reason why these terms are all difficult is because they overlap,
right?
So is anyone doing one thing? No, they may say they are, but they're probably doing some mix of all of these things, right. Or it's just that each one of these is a mix of all the other things. Because ultimately, we're ending in the same place, which is I want to know what kind of code I should write. Whether that's based on a domain, whether that's based on a PowerPoint, whether that's based on a giant Cucumber file or based on a failing test, I think you're ultimately trying to say, how do I write code that I can ensure is correct?
What is RDD, Eric?
REPL-driven design.
Oh, I do that. I do REPL-driven design for sure. I do paper-driven design. I write a lot of things down and then I'm just okay, that's my checklist. Okay, cool. Yeah. And then test-driven design. I feel like TDD is the best practice that people need to learn. Everything else is a fancy word for something else. But that's just me. When starting on a new project, what do you design first? When we get a new client, how do you guys think about deconstructing whatever the idea is in their head and how, and Dan, especially for you, because you spent a lot of time in early client product meetings. how do you think about starting or breaking down a problem at the project level?
Yeah, I mean, it's about understanding what we're trying to accomplish and then decomposing that into, what do I think are the big modules, right? So I like to start on a whiteboard and just kind of draw things out. Someone will say, oh, I want a user. So it's like, okay, well, you write user on the board, right? And then you try to come up with a better name than user because user is horrible, right? No one wants to be called a user. So it's like, okay, well, I want the player or the accountant or these people have like real names, real roles within society, and we want to capture that.
But at the database level, they're always a user.
Maybe. So
a user with a type column.
So you start there, and then you say, okay, so what is this person going to do, right? And it's like, okay, well, they're gonna sign up, they're gonna add credit card details. It's like, okay, so you're starting to build up the pieces, maybe the domains, right? Of what concepts, what nouns is this system going to entail, and then you talk about flows. Okay, so I'm going to move from part A to part B to part C, and what is it that I need to do there? What validates that I'm allowed to do that?
Yeah, so you're starting at the data level.
I mean, I tend to think about things at the data level, right? Like a client says something, and I'm immediately thinking about database tables.
Right.
For better or for worse, right? That's how I break down a problem. Is like, okay, what am I going to store where? How are these pieces going to relate? And then I kind of maybe that's pretty low level to be thinking about, but I think it informs so much about how you're going to make the system. And I think making your data model match reality makes the system so much easier to maintain and so much easier for a developer to understand. Because if I sit down and I explain to you the real nouns of a process, and then you look at the code and none of them match, and everything's like normalized down to the point where you need like 8 tables just to figure out one thing, then it's going to be so difficult for somebody to ramp up onto something, or even for myself to support it 3 months from now. Right. All legacy code is code that hasn't been looked at in 3 months, regardless of whether you wrote it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I just try to make reality mirror, in the code as much as possible. And so that's where I think maybe that's where that approach comes from.
Eric, do you have a different take? Because you were nodding when he was talking about sort of starting at the data level. And do you have a different take on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of have similar. It's probably also because we've worked for like 9 years together. So
right.
I think I like to have a similar approach. I feel like most of the time when we start new projects, we have some big document that the client has written out, like, this is what I want the system to do. And then we have to try and break that down into like topics or stories, epics, whatever nouns you want to use. I think we came up with a bunch of, I already forgotten them, Dan, but like defined our nouns, and like, so we just make a list of things in the correct order of like, we'll bootstrap Phoenix, we'll do authentication, we'll make an admin panel, we'll do this. And so like, that's how I like to kind of like create the backlog of stuff you will do in the order that you'll do it based on that big document that the client has written out.
Yeah. So this is so interesting that you both answered this question this way. Because, you ask, the question is, when starting a new project, what do you design first, right? And so it's interesting because you both took it as like given a client with like an idea of what they want, like where do they go? But like right now, I've got a situation where I've got a client with a bunch of budget, but they don't really know what they're going to use it for. You know what I mean? And so then the question is a little bit more, it's even like, you're calling it low level, Dan. I was thinking like, I mean, that's pretty low level. That's like engineering level design, like designing the solution or like whatever you're going to build is even more of like a, I don't know, product manager problem maybe. And I think they're asking themselves about like the value.
Yeah, well, I mean, you explain something to me and I'll define some code that like accomplishes it, right? Yeah. Like, and that is why I'm a consultant and not a like product company, right? Defining product is hard. Like that is product road mapping and what's a good market fit and all those things. Those are hard, challenging problems. And I think there is a lot of collaboration that goes on between like technology and that process.
Yeah.
And I think SmartLogic is great in the sense of we've really tried to optimize for that, and we involve the developers early on, and everyone needs to be, understand the business case and be on that same page, because they inform each other. What is technically possible? And also what is the purpose of this so that I can write it the right way? But defining a product from nothing, that's challenging.
Yeah. I think if we're talking to like an Elixir developer and the question is like, how do I start designing this project? What you guys are saying is sort of technically correct. Like, what the problem is already at this point. The question is, how do you define that into ones and zeros? At the database level, data level, thinking about The information architecture. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. What other pre-coding planning? Like, we don't really whiteboard as much as I think some people do. I don't know. I'm on paper a lot. Are you guys on paper a lot? What do you use to like get the architecture into some sort of visual?
Yeah, I draw on paper a lot. I like to whiteboard, whatever's available, whether it's a whiteboard or a sketch or, an iPad with a pencil, like, I think the important part is drawing it out, right? Being able to free form, put something onto a page that is very unstructured, right? I think that's what's great about drawing is it's completely unstructured. If you open up a terminal or you open up a Vim buffer, right, you're forced into characters in order, line by line. And you have to, if you want to create unstructured things, you need to, add white space, which is, still very constraining. And you're going to spend most of your time getting the white space to align correctly.
Right.
So I think it's about starting with something that has as few boundaries on it as possible.
Yeah. It's about imposing boundaries. Eric, do you have any like tools that you use for pre-coding planning?
So I also use just a blank printer paper because since I was fully remote before current day, so I just generally didn't have the opportunity to whiteboard with everyone else in the office. So I sort of started getting into like writing stuff out on a sheet, and I think I've taken a picture and sent it to Dan before. That and the other thing I like to do is I'm on Linux, so it's called Mousepad, but it's just a like notes.exe type of thing, or notepad.exe in Linux, and just like typing stuff out in like a bullet point list of like like this, then this, then this, then this. So kind of like a to-do list of like everything that I could maybe want to do, and like just think about all the little weird edge cases and whatnot. So like kind of have a pretty good idea as to like what this thing will be, and then like send it to someone else, send it to Dan or you or whoever, and just be like, what do you think of this? Like, let's talk through it.
Yeah.
Like, what am I missing?
Yeah.
Type of thing.
I also design by checklist. Let's talk about APIs because, we talked about the data layer a little bit. We're thinking about things in terms of, I think the database and the relations on the database is really what we meant. The API is sort of a level above that. I mean, there's logic. There are, accessible APIs like online. First of all, what does it mean? Like, how broad is the name API? Like, what all does API encompass for you guys?
Everything.
Everything's an API.
I think at this point, when you say API, you're specifically referring to an HTTP API. Mm-hmm. I think that's definitely co-opted the name at this point. So whether you're doing whatever specific style you're doing, it's over the HTTP protocol. If it's REST or GraphQL or
for the nature of the work we do, that's like, covers basically all the cases. If we were making like low level libraries for iPhones or, something like that, then maybe we would consider that the API of our SDK. But when we say API, we really mean, generally something HTTP based.
If it's on the web, it's an API. If it's native, it's an SDK.
Sure. I'm sure someone will fight you on that, just like they'll fight you on Cucumber.
Oh man. The best fight is, what's the difference between coding and programming?
Well, we're starting season 4 with controversy, it sounds like. I don't know.
Tabs or spaces?
No, only spaces.
And why should you fire everyone who uses Emacs?
Yeah. Also, VS Code.
I used to be a big Emacs user. I'm not anymore.
If you use something that can be described as an IDE, you're fired.
That is also not true. But we're the only 3 people, I think, who still use Vim. So
no, SmartLogic, we use Vim. That's what Giancarlo told me when I started. And now I tell everybody, and they're all like, no, we're going to use this, like, I don't know, it's like a cartoon game or something. It's got like Comic Sans and like bright colors.
I don't know what you're talking about.
VS Code.
That's all right. That's mean.
Like it's a sandbox. All right, I'm sorry. I'm going to trigger some like VS Code users in our audience. I'm sorry. So APIs, like, what do? We use GraphQL, we use REST, we use SOAP. I exclusively design SOAP. Do either of you guys actually know what SOAP APIs are?
Yes.
Okay. Could you enlighten a younger developer?
It's like a very XML-y RPC type of thing, is my understanding.
Simple Object Access Protocol.
Yeah. It's a bunch of very strict XML to invoke functions on a remote server.
I want to know, do you guys agree on what the word REST stands for?
representational state transfer is what it's supposed to stand for.
Yeah, no,
sure. That sounds good.
When I Googled it,
sounds accurate.
And I always thought it was something like resource related, I thought that's what Rust was all about.
It is.
It's a representation of a resource.
Yeah. Maybe since Rust is much more important, obviously, we could do a definition of, like, first of all, for a number of years, REST API design was like really in vogue thing to talk about. I think we're past that point because everybody just like internalized it. Did that happen, or am I imagining that?
I mean, I think it happened, and then everyone got upset with it because all they did was write CRUD APIs, and that's relatively a bad pattern. And so like no one put thought into APIs. And I mean, early on, I was definitely a part of that. And
why is CRUD a bad pattern for APIs?
So, I mean, it's just like for REST, you should be thinking about state transitions of your resources. So like if I have an order, like what actions can I do on that order to like change it into different states? And so like that's like if you read Are
you telling me the actions aren't index, new, create, update, delete?
Correct.
The actions?
Yeah. What? One of the first times I went to RESTfest, Mike Amundsen said a pretty good line. It's like, I'm totally going to forget the actual quote at this point, but it somehow boiled down to like, don't show me your like database because that's like the underpants of your application. Like, I don't want to see it. So like your API does not have to equal exactly what tables you have. It's not to say that if it does, it's bad. It's like you just can put extra thought into it, and like you don't have to just directly export your database through like CRUD stuff. And there's like stuff where it's like, I think it's called Hasura, I think is what it is, where you can just put a GraphQL API on top of your database. And it's just like, I just sit there and go like, no, like that's like bad.
But why is it bad? Like,
like if you have a good API, it's intentionally designed. So like if you just plop out your database to the front end, then it's like it could be better, I guess, is more the like if you intentionally designed it to be what you need it to be, then you should hopefully have better resources and then less queries, blah blah blah, whatever. Like
so unless your intention is just like straight up access to a database.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, like, the point being, if you couple your API to your database, then you change your database. You can leave your API the same, but now they don't mirror. So any benefit you had of them mirroring from, I can keep this all in my head, you've then lost. Or you're then going to break your API because you've changed your database. And I think that's one of the things that like the whole Phoenix contexts, change, I think was so great and really, helped push people in that direction of, think about what API you want to have. And here, I mean, a programming API, between your controllers and your data model. What do you want to layer in there? And so, you'll see in, apps, we'll create like an accounts context that handles the management of users. And if we decide to change the users table or anything about how we manage users, we can keep that the interface of that accounts context exactly the same. And the controllers and the APIs that our mobile apps are calling can stay exactly the same. And you can replace behavior and update behavior. You can even move things off the server and access them through another API if you wanted to. And no one outside of your context would be any the wiser. And so that lets you create that modularity that lets you move things around and also test things in isolation. I mean, that's where I think Phoenix Context and Elixir has pushed us in positive directions from a testing standpoint, because you can say, okay, this is my boundary, and all I care about is the shape of the data in and the shape of the data out. And I can test that. And whether I have a running web process or not is irrelevant. Whether I have an actual database or not is irrelevant, right? We can just test the manipulation of this data and ensure that it's behaving correctly. And then when you pull the pieces together, you can be, a high level of confidence that it's going to work.
I'm wondering how much more time we should spend on this like HTTP stuff. I guess we have to mention GraphQL. So talk about GraphQL.
Sure. It's mentioned. Let's move on.
Eric, anything to add there?
Nope.
Okay. Obviously, SmartLogic is not bullish on GraphQL. Yeah, let's go on. I'm curious, how has your thinking about designing an application architecture evolved, especially like over the last few years since we've picked up Elixir as like the main thing that we do? How has your thought process around the architecting, from beginning to, an ongoing iteration process, how has that changed? Dan?
I think it is extremely easy and extremely dangerous to over-architect a system. And if you try to plan for every contingency, every, well, what if, you'll build a bunch of things that never are used or never happen or you never encounter. I remember long ago people saying like, oh, like if you spend all your time making your application so it scales, you'll never get enough users that it actually needs to scale.
Right.
Right. And so it's about like prioritizing things. And I think from my standpoint, like design a system that you can iterate on is like the number one thing, because you will iterate on it. You're going to iterate on the product. Like most projects we start, we'll spec out 2 to 3 months worth of work. Where we end up is different because things change. The world changes. I mean, when everything is going on right now, the world changes, right? Priorities are going to shift. And it is important that you architect an application such that you can iterate your code to match the changing of reality. And I think that's where Elixir and Phoenix have really made me feel good about the work that we're doing because of its functional nature, because of the way we're doing low-level tests. It feels like we're building systems that can evolve with the changing needs. And we found that for the applications that are now 3 or 4 years old, when we need to make a change to them, we can drop into the module that we need to add some behavior to, we can add the behavior to it, we can test it, and then we can integrate it in without a giant re-architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think is important. So, design for the future, but don't try to guess what it's going to be.
Eric, I'm curious your response to this question, because building Xventure, you've gotten to really dive into having code running on multiple nodes, the sort of sweet spot for developing Elixir applications. What have you learned?
I think like there's definitely, I feel like the biggest thing that I've learned that's in like my design process that's changed has just been like, I don't know what the best way to describe it is, of like just having Elixir sink in enough to like not try to make a Rails app that is Elixir, or I happen to be making a Ruby Elixir app type of thing.
What do you mean by that?
Where like the writing style that you're doing is still of like, I came from Ruby, so I might be writing an Elixir application that you could almost just like copy paste into Ruby type of thing.
Right.
And just make it, assume it's like functional Ruby or whatever. Mm-hmm. So like having stuff seep in enough has just been kind of the big change, where like Xventure definitely feels like a Rails app or something similar.
I was going to say that, well, it's more of just a comment that like Elixir benefits from this weird asymmetry that Ruby doesn't benefit from, where like if you bring OOP to Elixir world, it makes your Elixir code worse. But if you bring functional thinking to your Rails applications, it'll make your Rails applications better. Yeah. So yeah, like learning Elixir does seem to be really more functional programming. Learning functional programming seems to be like a force multiplier in your ability to architect a good system. Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, like, the more variety of experience you have, the more different areas of thought you can pull on. I think, those are all tools to building something. And so introducing something
you're a better
new.
Developer for like learning object-oriented programming?
Sure.
I wonder.
I don't have the perspective of learning programming from a functional first paradigm, right? Like I did not learn it that way. Yeah. But I think like, if you're trying to explain programming to somebody, like people can relate to objects, like objects that have methods on them, people can understand that. They understand what a car is. They understand that if you tell a car to lock its doors, that something about that object will change, right? They don't think about it as like, lock is a function. And when you put your car into the lock function, you get back a different car that is now locked.
See, when you call it a function, no. But if you call it a process, people might.
Transformation.
Yeah.
All right. And for someone who knows nothing about any of this,
what are you talking about?
Now you have a bunch of other vocabulary you have to define.
Right. Well, I just wonder if like this is like a confirmation bias thing, where because we all learned OOP first, we're like, yeah, it was good that we learned OOP. But like when you think about like, does OOP actually contain some kind of isomorphism about the real world, or is it like an unnecessary layer of abstraction between the actual isomorphism, which is that the universe is made up of processes, right? And things like a human being isn't an object. A human being is a process, and the process begins and it ends, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, you can come up with whatever set of nouns you want to describe anything, right? Like, but the point I'm trying to make is not learning one way or the other is better. My point is that learning lots of ways is probably going to help you.
This is a fascinating philosophical question. Okay, we don't have a lot more time, but I want to get into microservices because there's a hot take here somewhere. I feel like 2020 is the year where we destroy all our angels. You know, what are they called? Kill our darlings, kill our babies. But you know what I'm saying? Like where we like take microservices, single page applications. You know, SOAP nobody cares about, but REST maybe. You know, like this could be the year that we just destroy all the things that we love in software engineering and are reborn with things that we like functional programming.
Do you have a point there, or are you just excited?
Microservices. Talk about them. Is this the year that we get to kill microservices?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by microservices. You know, you can do too much of anything, right? You can have too big of a monolith. You can have too many microservices. You can use Kubernetes before you should. You can abuse Heroku, right? You can have so many VPSs that are custom configured that now you have a nightmare, right? Like you can make anything into a maintenance nightmare.
How many people do you think you should have on your staff before you consider engineering like a microservices architecture into your product?
Why is that the metric you're going to use to make that determination?
Because I think that you need a DevOps person to run a microservices architecture. Like, I don't really think that you can, like, one person can like build like a whole product on a microservices architecture. Now, there might be like a genius out there, like a prodigy type of human being who's like capable of that.
I definitely tried going that route for Grapevine. I had 3 or 4 projects going at once that were all kind of using WebSockets to keep in sync. And it was working, but it was definitely way too much for one person to be worth it. So then that's when I collapsed back to a monolith application. And that was definitely the better choice, I think.
Do you think you would have had a better architecture if you had architected it as a monolith from the ground up?
I don't know. So like the way that started was Gossip was born, and then it was like purely chat, and like you would register your game, and like that's how it worked. And then like Grapevine came along and was like a listing Steam type site that like let you look into the Gossip network. So I don't regret the choice to start that way. I had a lot of fun doing some kind of WebSockety real-time stuff. So like I think as far as was it worth it because I enjoyed what I was doing because it was a hobby project. I totally thought it was worth it. But like if this was a client project, what would I have done? I probably just would have turned Gossip into a listing site and just kept it a single monolith application.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any given code base can't like be bigger than the team can manage, right? And so like if you have a team that can take on your monolith and do what needs to be done in it, then great. But then in the same sense, a small team can't necessarily manage a whole bunch of different applications all at the same time and expect to orchestrate them correctly. And so, you know, but then does that mean that it needs to be a microservice with some sort of protocol between them that is on the network? Not necessarily, right? Like you could break out a team that's just working on something where the API is an SDK and it's being pulled in as a hex package or as a gem, and you can iterate on that. And I think what's important there is the same thing that would be important as if it was over the network, is that you agree on an API, you agree on how these two things are going to communicate. And then you then don't need to keep the implementation of that in your brain when you're working on it. You just need to keep the API in your brain so that you know how to interact with it. Right. And so drawing those segments between components as your team grows, as your product grows, I think is important. But is RESTful microservices or GraphQL microservices the solution? Maybe. Is making it a hex package and pulling it in the solution? Maybe. Yeah. And I think the things that matter there are constraints of your environment, constraints of how you want to be able to deploy it, constraints of your staff expertise, and then also just the constraints of legacy. And I think maybe one of the reasons this is such a hot topic on like the Elixir community of like, oh, like don't do microservices is because like we have great ability to put a bunch of apps together in an umbrella, right? Or have them run as like in the nerves like Poncho style, or just be like, hey, I have a folder full of code. I'm just going to drop it into this project. And now it is a module that I can access from any of my controllers. Right. Like it's convention then on how you want to segment things out.
Yeah. I guess there's also a matter of definitions here, which is like, I don't consider like a single page application with like a separate API. Like those are both one application's talking over the network to another. I don't think that's a microservice architecture. You know what I mean?
If that single page application is the only consumer, then no, it's barely an API, right? It's just two components of the system who talk a certain way.
And so then the question is like, at what point do you end up in microservice? Like when I think of I guess maybe I don't know if I'm a purist. I don't know what the purest definition of microservice would be, but I assume that a pure definition of microservices would be like, something over the network that provides just one piece of responsibility, and that's how the entire system is architected, right? So like if we were to take a common, like a blog application and turn it into a microservice architecture, it would have like a user service, and it would have like a content management service, and it would have like a cache service all spun up. And like in that case, right, like it would just make way more sense to make that one application if you're doing it in Elixir. That's why I'm like, can we kill microservices? I know that we can't really, because there are situations like what you're talking about where you would need to have things accessing one another over the network. We want to wrap up with some kind of conversation just about like where we think the future is going to, like, we glided right past GraphQL. Maybe that's not in the future for us. Like, what are we hoping for? What are we expecting from the future of our applications and from architecting systems? Dan, do you want to talk about like what we're hoping for or what you think we can expect to see?
I'm excited about the community continuing to just not assume that the way we've been doing things is the right way to do things, and I try to not bog myself down in buzzwords and dogma, and look for what are the lessons we can learn from the things that are going on. Mm-hmm. And I feel like Elixir has been a shining example of that, in the sense of, hey, it's got a Ruby inspired syntax because we like the way Ruby looks, but it takes advantage of the multi-process actor model of Erlang, right? And so it's like, okay, so like we've taken things that we like about existing pieces and pulled them together in a unique and interesting way. And Phoenix, looked a lot like Rails when it was early on, and now it looks kind of different, right? But it's still kind of inspired by it, but it brings its own approaches to things. And so I think my hope for the future, my hope for what SmartLogic continues to do with these technologies is to, evolve our usage informed by experience, and continue to pick tools that are flexible enough to adapt to like the changing needs of our projects. Similar to what I was saying about, designing a system, over engineering a system and then trying to implement it, or preparing for the future that never comes. It's from my standpoint, it's more about picking tools that you can adapt with. And that's why I enjoy Elixir. That's why I enjoy the things we've done with, the ways we've decided to use Docker or not use Docker, the way we've used Heroku or not use Heroku, the way that we've tried different CI systems, letting ourselves pick the best tool at the time, but trying to ensure that we're not too locked into any one approach.
Mm-hmm. Eric, do you have anything to add? Any aspirations? Do you think we're ever going to have codeless development?
I hope not. What's it? Drag and drop coding? Is that?
Yeah, you want a wizard
No.
wig? No, okay.
No, I don't.
No, but seriously, what are you hoping for? What do you expect to see?
I think I expect to see more, and also hope for more like real time stuff. So like WebSockets and Phoenix Live View and all that fun stuff. I've had a blast doing a bunch of the weird WebSocket stuff I've done for all my projects, and kind of long-lived TCP connections through Telnet, whatever. I think there's a lot of stuff you can do with WebSockets that like most of our clients would love a real-time site, but it's like, I don't know, making that work well and like seeing where that heads, I think will be pretty cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that made me think of something else too that I think is a benefit to the Elixir community, and that's the Nerves project. Because that's just, it's a whole nother set of constraints. It's a whole nother set of things to keep in mind. And that's informing things in Elixir, and Elixir's informing things there. And developers who are working in both communities they're learning things, they're sharing things. This world of web development has just been continually pushing to not necessarily care about resource constraints, because resources are cheap. And then you take the Nerves community, and they're extremely resource constrained, and they're in environments where there are not unlimited resources, there's not unlimited bandwidth. And so, when I talk about the diversity of a community, the diversity of teams, the diversity of a language, those are the things that attract me to the Elixir community, because there is that diversity that's informing how this is being made. Rails is great at building apps that are a lot like Basecamp because that's what Rails was built to do. And it's great at it. And I built a lot of things that I still hold dear to my heart in Rails. And I can still do a lot of things really fast in Rails if it aligns with those needs. What I like about Elixir and the community is that the alignment to needs seems more broad, or at least it seems like a set of tools that I can use to meet a more wide variety of needs. And at the level that we're at the types of work that we're doing, at what we hope to achieve as a company, like a bunch of really good, solid tools is way more important than, one really fancy device that works, some of the time.
Well said, Dan. Well, I would say, do you have any more plugs or asks for the audience? Any final shameless self-promotion, Dan, before we let you go?
Yeah, I'm not super up on the socials. I mean, I'm Dan Ivovich in most places. If you want to check me out, my blog is pretty stagnant. I'll use this opportunity to just plug SmartLogic. I feel really great about the team that I have working for me here and our ability to solve a variety of problems using some of the best technologies that we've been able to procure and become experts at. So if you're interested in talking about a project that you're working on or an idea you have, or you have a team that could use some extra support or kind of take that project off your plate, hit us up.
Eric, do you have any final plugs or asks for the audience?
Go check out xventure at xventure.org or the new Kalevala at my GitHub, Oestrich /Calevala.
Wait, starts with a C?
Or K. Yeah, wow. I'm bad at spelling.
Oh, man.
check
the show notes for links.
Before we wrap the show, we have a special segment that we're testing out and you're about to hear. Pattern Matching with Todd, hosted by our friend and occasional co-host Todd Rezadek. We've heard feedback that you all would like to learn more and get to know some of our guests better. Pattern matching is a segment dedicated to just that. Todd has 5 questions he'll be asking a variety of special guests, and we'll be sharing them throughout the season. Let us know what you think of this new segment. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, now, here's our first ever Pattern Matching with Todd.
All right. Thank you for joining me today for this episode of Pattern Matching. My guest is the Leonardo da Vinci of embedded Elixir. He's a member of the Nerves core team, and he's known for creating some amazing, if not always practical, devices. Taking some time away from his duties at Binary Noggin, welcome Connor Rigby.
Hello.
Hi, Connor. Thanks for joining me today. So if you're not familiar with the segment, we have 5 questions for you. They're the same 5 questions for every guest, and the idea is just to get to know you a little bit better. So where were you born?
I was born in Redding, California, a tiny little town on the main highway in the States, way up north, not really where most people like to hang out.
Oh, all right. Up in Humboldt or north of Humboldt?
About the same level of northness as Humboldt, but inland, not on the coast, right in the middle of the desert.
Okay, cool. They've got some interesting industry up there.
Yeah.
So where do you live now?
Now, I just recently, a couple of years ago, moved to about the middle of the state in a tiny town called Morro Bay, California. It's right on the 1. If you ever drove the 1 from SF to LA, for example, you would have driven through it. It's right around near San Luis Obispo.
Cool. So nice little beach town in the central coast.
Yep.
Cool. And you live up there with your significant other and a collection of cars and electronics, from what I remember.
Yeah, that's about right.
All right. So how many cars do you have at your house right now?
Right now, I'm down to 2. That's all I have at the moment. I've been selling them left and right.
Okay. So what's the most number of cars you've had on your property in your life?
Well, so usually I like to store them not on my property. Neighbors aren't usually super stoked with a bunch of broken cars. So probably 4 at my last apartment. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with probably more car space internally than I had floor space of the apartment.
Okay. So 4 cars, and I guess just to explain that a little bit, I think you're into like autocross, or are you just into working on cars, or what?
Yeah, a bit of autocross, a bit of on-track racing.
Wow.
Not usually super picky. Don't do any off-road stuff, though.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think the last car I remember you buying was an old RX-7.
Yep, bright yellow one. I actually bought 3 of them all at once. Fixed one of them. Just sold it not that long ago.
Oh, okay. Very cool. So have you had any careers before programming?
No real ones. I kind of went straight into programming right out of school.
Okay, you're pretty young, right?
Yeah, 23.
Okay. So you went to, sorry, when you say out of school, do you mean like high school,
out of high
college?
school. Yeah, I skipped out on college. Yeah, I was one of the 6 people who knew how to work a computer in Redding, California. So they were happy to, give me a job doing that.
Sweet. Yeah, hey, if you can, I would say go for it.
I try to tell everyone to if it works for you.
Yeah, it works for LeBron. You didn't waste that 8 months in college. So if you weren't a programmer, what do you think you'd be?
I don't know. If I wasn't a programmer, I would probably just be a California beach bum. I don't have a ton of marketable skills outside of programming.
Okay. So a Lebowski type?
Yeah.
Nice.
Lebowski, what a reference.
Well, hopefully everybody understands what I'm talking about. Get some imagery from that. If you don't, I'm sorry. You'll have to Bing it. The Lebowski, the dude.
The guy.
The dude. Yes, the dude. Okay. Cool. So what was the genre of the last song or album you listened to?
Man, I answered this morning and now I have to look again. I just listened to Aesop Rock's new album, which is a rap album.
Okay, let's go with what you said this morning.
This morning, I usually start my day off with some sort of metal album, usually. I bounce between a lot of genres, but usually it starts with a metal album of some sort and gets progressively less intense as the day goes by. Okay. I don't do that actively, it just happens.
Okay, so this is dear to my heart. So we talk about metal, like metal is composed of vast number of subgenres. Yeah, so maybe can you give me the subgenre or maybe be a little bit more specific as to what kind of metal you're into?
I guess a subgenre would be maybe post-hardcore punk, maybe. Depending on how you want to classify it, where you want to draw the lines on the arbitrary rules. Stuff like A Day to Remember, maybe We Came as Romans. I'm trying to think of other popular bands.
Okay.
Here, hold on. We'll pull up Spotify right now. We'll see what's on the queue. All There Remains, they're pretty popular.
Okay.
Stuff kind of in that general. Hopefully I just gave someone some new stuff to listen to.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. I've been really getting into power metal lately.
Oh, power metal's a bit high energy.
Really? Okay. All right. That's cool. To each his own, I guess. But the point is there's a lot of different kinds of metal. So when you say you like metal, and then you tell somebody, I like new metal, and they'll be like, that's
Korn, my favorite.
Yeah. So just because 2 people like metal doesn't mean they have anything in common about music.
I like to keep it vague because not everyone wants to hear the minute differences between 2 different genres of metal.
Yeah. Okay. I'm maybe one of the few outside of Northern Europe, I guess, that's really into distinguishing the differences.
I'm not going to go talking about metal in Northern Europe. It's Germans.
Yeah. Is it Germans and the Swedes?
Oh, the Swedes, they're on their own level of metal.
Yeah. So I was talking to Eric Meadows Johnson recently, who doesn't strike me as somebody who's particularly into metal. But I mentioned that I was going to see a band called Sabaton, which is from a smaller city north of Stockholm. And he immediately knew exactly who I was talking about.
Amazing.
So yeah, I think it's compulsory in the Swedish education system to at least know.
You have to at least know who they are.
Yeah. I liken it to Brazilians. Even if they're not into soccer, they still know way more about soccer than most people.
Oh, correct. Yeah.
Totally. Okay. Well, cool. So let's talk about your taste in movies or TV shows. So let's say you're flipping through the channels. What's one movie or TV show that you would stop and watch, pretty much any time?
Oh, man. So I don't watch a ton of TV or movies, but if we're going for TV, basically anything animated. I love cartoons. Old Cartoon Network cartoons, even the real old Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny, Tom and Jerry, that stuff. If there's a cartoon on a TV, I will stop and watch it. As for movies, I don't watch a ton of movies. Probably, if I had to pick one that I would watch no matter where I saw it, I would definitely sit down and watch Donnie Darko. It's just one of those stupidly over-the-top movies that they went well out of their way to make it make no sense. And, understanding it is up to the viewer.
Okay. Yeah, that's one I haven't seen. My wife loves it. I don't know why, but I've never seen it.
Jake Gyllenhaal can be a chore to view sometimes.
Okay. Who's the director of that?
I don't remember who directed it.
Is it
Probably
Aronofsky?
someone.
It's like Darren Aronofsky or somebody.
Let's see. Richard Kelly, who I am unfamiliar with. I don't know what else he made.
Oh, okay.
Nothing good, it turns out, according to Google.
Okay. Well, congratulations, Richard Kelly, for making one more good movie than I've made. Okay, cool. And to wrap it up, let's talk about what project are you most excited about working on next? So either something you're working on now or something you're really excited to get started working on soon.
So I've been working with Frank Hunlith on Wi-Fi meshing, and maybe no one else cares as much about this as I do, but I think it's just amazing. Basically, the idea that you don't need a central router to connect all of your Wi-Fi devices. So imagine you get home and there's no central router that your phone connects to get on your Wi-Fi network, but it just connects to whatever's closest, your light bulb, your refrigerator, whatever ridiculous component that you have in your house connected to the internet. So we're working on adding support into that with Nerves right now. So your Nerves devices don't need to be configured to connect to a router to talk to each other. Say you have a local network of Nerves devices, you can configure them to just talk directly to each other. So right now I've got like a test bench in my house. I have a 2-story house, and there's a device upstairs that needs to talk to a device downstairs. They cannot talk directly to each other because the distance is so great. But by putting one more of these devices in between them, they can now reach each other, and all 3 of them can communicate with each other. So rather than the classic, client-server relationship that you might have in Wi-Fi, you get the meshing of it.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess that reminds me of like the Z-Wave protocol.
Similar.
Okay. So you'd set up your Nerves device to act as an access point as well as...
Well, so it's actually part of the specification where Wi-Fi devices, so it's neither an access point or a client or infrastructure if you're into the actual terminology. It's a brand new mode, brand new as of 2016, I think, called mesh mode, where it doesn't actually act as a client or server. It kind of acts as both simultaneously, more of a node than a client or a server. And there's a lot of really complex routing and math that goes on under the thank God someone smarter than me figured out.
Nice. And they somewhat documented it?
Well, as much as anything in Linux is documented.
Nice. Cool. So you'd have one Nerves device that maybe reaches out to the internet, and then any other Nerves device just needs to reach one of those other
or any
devices.
of the other ones. Right. So my test bench is I have there's one device connected to the internet. And by connecting that one device to the internet, my test bench of 6 other devices all mesh together. And as long as that one device that's connected to the internet is in the mesh, they all have internet.
Nice. Well, cool. Well, thanks for joining me today, Connor. It was a real pleasure getting to know you a little bit more. And hopefully we'll see you at a conference soon.
If we're ever allowed to go in them again.
Yes, or a virtual conference.
A virtual one, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Well, that's it for another episode of Elixir Wizards. We are so glad to be back at you for season 4 on system and application architecture. My name is Justus Eapen. I'm joined by my co-host, Eric Oestrich, and our Director of Development Operations at SmartLogic, Dan Ivovich. Elixir Wizards is a SmartLogic podcast. Here at SmartLogic, we're always looking to take on new projects building web apps in Elixir, Rails, and React. Infrastructure projects using Kubernetes, in case microservices isn't actually dead, and mobile apps using React Native. We'd love to hear from you if you have a project that we could help you with. Don't forget to like and subscribe on your favorite podcast player. You can also find us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, so add us on all of those. You can find me personally online at Justus Eapen and Eric at Eric Oestrich. And join us again next week on Elixir Wizards for more application and system architecture.